Now that I know that you're a Magic the Gathering fan, next time we were in person at a convention, I will bring a blue control deck just to annoy you.
I'm not sure if I'm mad or impressed yet.
Welcome to the Skiffy and Fanty Show's Screen Scouts.
Let's go steal a podcast.
Yay! I'm Sean.
I'm Brandon.
And on today's show, we have the most delightful, wonderful, amazing Michi Trota, multi-award-winning editor from many different things, and a really awesome person who has been on this show before, so welcome back.
Thanks so much for inviting me. I'm super excited for the topic of the show today.
Wonderful! So, today, we're going to be discussing Leverage Redemption, which is airing right now on IMDb TV. Specifically, the first 8 episodes of what's supposed to be a 16-episode season was released on July 9th, 2021, and we should be expecting the next 8 sometime in September, I believe. So that's what we're going to be talking about today.
But before we do that, friendly reminder for folks that we want to hear from you. And we've been saying this over and over, so please get those thoughts in, especially if you're a Leverage fan. We'd love to hear your thoughts about this first half of the season, if you've seen it yet. Go to skiffyandfanny.com/listener suggestions. We're putting together that mailbag episode, so we need those questions, topics, suggestions, thoughts, all that stuff in there. So stick it in there, and then Brandon and I will talk about it.
Cool, so let's get into the actual discussion. Leverage Redemption returns several years after the end of the original series Leverage, which ran for 5 seasons, if I'm not mistaken. So we are returning to this lovable band of misfits several years afterward, after their mastermind, Nathan Ford, has passed away. And on the 1-year anniversary of his passing, the rest of the crew has decided to visit Sophie Devereaux, who has been in mourning in her own way, struggling to figure out what she wants to do next, when our favorite thieves, Parker, Alec Hardison, and Elliot Spencer, decide maybe we just want to get back into the thing. And that's when they run into a lawyer named Harry Wilson, who is in the middle of stealing a painting in an art gallery, when they decide, maybe he's really the project that we need to be working on. And what proceeds is the attempt to turn him into a mastermind, an inside man, as they foil the nefarious doings of, among other people, a Martin Shkreli analog, who likes a Magic the Gathering-esque card game, a Sackler family analog who is in love with his reputation being bolstered by putting paintings in art galleries, an assassin who attempts to perform a hit during a Halloween parade, and so much more. And it's fun and it's beautiful, and I love every single moment of every single episode, and I can't wait to talk more about it.
I could figure that immediately. Like, oh, was Brandon gonna like this? Yes, Brandon was going to like it. The second the first episode hit, I was like, yep, Brandon is gonna be sold immediately.
I remember watching the first episode in the middle of the night, and then pausing and going, hey, that's definitely Richard Sackler. I'm going to enjoy this a great deal, because he deserves it in real life. I definitely want to ask Michi, who I'm willing to bet is like the number 1 super fan on the planet Earth of Leverage and all things Leverage. How did you feel about the first 8 episodes of this so far?
I thought, honestly, it gave me a lot of, it made me feel a lot like watching the first 2 seasons of the original Leverage, and I mean that in a good way. It was very clear from the first 2 episodes that this was Leverage. It was spot on. It had all of those touch points. You had Elliot saying, it's a very distinctive fill in the blank. Hardison has clearly leveled up. He's not just a hacker anymore. He's a real life oracle from DC Comics. Like, he's this close to being like the actual mind of the machine. It was actually nice seeing how all the characters had definitely grown in the supposed 8 years since we had previously seen them after, the last episode of season 5. But they were still at the core who we remember them being. So that was nice. It's not like they had been frozen in amber. They had clearly had life experiences, particularly for Elliot, Hardison, and Parker. They have leveled up quite a bit in their game. And even without Nathan Ford around, and even though Hardison isn't around for the latter 6 episodes of the season, because Aldous Hodge is a guy in very high demand. It's been wonderful seeing his career take off since Leverage ended, and I am super looking forward to him as Hawkman in the next DC movie. But they still kept the formula that works, but they didn't try to replace anyone. You still have, our original 4 as grifter, hitter, hacker, and grifter, hitter, hacker, and thief. I didn't feel like they were trying to make Wilson into a mastermind. He was the inside man. And that was a completely different set of skills that didn't preclude him from learning how to be a mastermind and learning how to run a con, but he was coming at it from a different kind of insider knowledge that, in a similar way to Nathan Ford having insider knowledge about cons working, because he used to be an insurance investigator, an insurance fraud investigator. And even bringing on Hardison's younger foster sister, who I believe they're implying is pretty much the same age that Hardison was when he started with the Leverage Gang, or maybe just like a titch younger. But she's still, she's a hacker, but she's also more than that. She has her own skill set. She's really good at, I think they had billed her in all the promos as the Maker. They're not trying to replace anybody from the original team, but they're still filling in those patches just with different characters who get to be their own people. I love that they address the fact that Brianna worries about having to be Hardison for the team. And I believe in one of the later episodes, they tell her, like, no, I'm sorry, we should have said this to you earlier. We don't need you to be Hardison. We need you to be who you are, because that's why you're part of this team. So yeah. I appreciate that is sort of the spirit that they're bringing in. They brought to this whole reboot. They're not trying to replace or revisit where we've already been. They want to give us the characters we're familiar with, and for us to see how they've grown and to see how the world has changed and how they're reacting to that.
Something that Michi was suggesting in what you were talking about there that I thought was really interesting about the show was how important it is in this show, the theme of learning and teaching, because there are tons of that happening throughout, right? The first 2 episodes, you have Noah Wile's character, Harry Wilson, basically being taught how to be a con man, because he's never done this before in his life, and he's having to be taught by a number of different characters, different aspects. But then you also have Brianna Casey, played by Lee Shannon again, who is figuring out how to be part of this team, but also teaching, at some cases, either learning from Parker how to do heisty stuff like sleight of hand, but also having to teach Parker and some of the others about interests of her own. The card game job, for example, in which literally she's the one who knows the most about the card game, and it's her knowledge that ends up helping to solve the case, or to not solve the case, I guess, and more particularly to effectively get the Martin Shkreli douche nozzle that is there in this movie, or whatever term we want to use for him. Yeah.
I think that works.
Bless John Rogers and the rest of the Leverage writers. They didn't even bother to be subtle with who the villains are in this new world. It is, I appreciate that's one of the things that I think we all loved so much about the original Leverage, is that it was like, yeah, the villains are corporations. They're rich, privileged, quite often white men who feel that the rules don't apply to them, so they can break them with impunity. And I really love how they mention that the game is different and more dangerous now, because it's not even that these people are breaking the rules, it's that they're changing the rules so they're not even worried about getting caught, because they have now bribed the right people, they've changed the right laws. that nothing, it doesn't apply to them at all. It's up to the ante. And even with Brianna as the youngest person on the team, I love that she specifically says what her perspective is as a Gen Zer, where she's like her earliest memories are 9/11. Living through multiple economic crashes, multiple wars. I mean, I think about what my memories are as a Gen Xer, and I'm like, yep, it's all of that plus all of this other stuff on top of that. And I love how she says, like, it's not that she's scared of confronting these new villains, because she's like, oh yeah, she's already been screwing with the system and got on the FBI's watch list because of it. But what scares her is that it can't be fixed, and that the injustices can't be addressed, that there's no possible justice to be found. That's really what scares her.
There's an aspect in that I think was interesting, because at the end of the fifth season, and obviously we get that brought up again in the first two episodes, but this idea of Leverage International is a thing that now exists, that there are multiple crews, and there's this sense of like Leverage is like a band-aid on a massive global problem of very wealthy and powerful people getting, and all the way from the bottom up in terms of those powers and wealth, but getting away with doing horrible things to people, which may or may not be fully legal, but they get away with it nonetheless. And this is why one of the episodes, I can't remember which one, that cracked me up the most was when they the tower job, right, where they
Oh
get them
yes.
by hiding the clause that allows them to walk away from the contract that they'd signed, right, and that it's all just buried in there. And when they go, like, why did you not just read it? And it's like, well, part of this, the whole premise of this, is that these are people who have been in power so long that they just think the world kind of revolves around them. They don't have to do this because they're the ones that have been playing the game. They don't expect the game to be played on them, and it does. And there's other stuff in that episode too. And so I love that is part of this here. Is, some of these episodes, they're deliberately trying to use the system against the very people who have created the system that allowed them to do what they do in the first place.
Yeah. And like one of the things that I really adore about Leverage Redemption in particular is it's very easy when a show has been running for 4 or 5 years already to decide when you're bringing it back to just give people the thing that they already like. But I do feel like Redemption has made very dramatic shifts in the way that the show actually performs its themes simply by introducing different characters and having them perform their roles in unique ways. Like Michi mentioned, having Brianna on the team means that they get to not only observe the act of hacking several years in advancement, but to also have a conversation about what the kinds of things that are happening in the wider world around us have affected people of other generations, people who are younger and have more recent memories of some of the most traumatic social events in their lifetime. But one of the things that really stands out to me in that sense is Harry Wilson as a character is fundamentally different from Nathan Ford in a lot of very minor ways that are also very dramatic. Being a lawyer means that instead of being the person who observes whether someone else has committed a crime, he's the person who is often helping other people commit crimes and has spent a great deal of time not liking it and knows those rules because he's part of the system that makes it easy for those rules to change. And as a result, the show fundamentally asks this unique question that is totally different from the original series, in my opinion, where Nate's primary driver is, I want to stick it to these bad guys because when I needed people to defend me, when I needed people to stick up for my son when my son was dying, no one would do that because they didn't want to just use the power that they had to do good. And there's this very strong sense in that series of, will I be whole if I do bad things to bad people?
Mm.
But Harry's drive is completely different. His drive is, will I be whole if I do good things for good people at the expense of bad people? But the show is still the same. And that shift in perspective is actually very intriguing to me, because Harry is often very naive in ways that Nate isn't, but that like outside perspective is good not only for people to get into the series from the beginning and feel like they have someone to like be their surrogate when things happen, but it also helps reframe the fact that these bigwigs are doing like big, dramatically hurtful things, and there are people who are inside the system who often do not know the stakes until they actually see the people who are suffering. And I thought that that was really neat.
Yeah, I thought that I really liked how at one point, you know, Harry, I think it's like, it actually, I think it's the tower job where Harry, you know, goes to Sophie and says, "We're actually going pretty hard on that on this guy. Is that like, you know, we're using his phobias, which you know were triggered by a negligent event that he caused." I gotta say, watching that episode right after the Miami Tower collapse was just like, oh, I know that it's not about this because I remember that there was a similar construction issue. Wasn't it? I think where like there was a crane fell off a building, you know, the foundation, you know, it had been put together shoddily, so it didn't even make it all the way up. And several people died. But seeing that episode right after the Miami Tower collapse just was like, oh, God, it's not that this show can tell the future. It's that this has already happened. It just so happens that the episode came out right when another iteration of that kind of accident happened. But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
because the Harry asked Sophie, is like, is this okay? I mean, we're doing some pretty bad stuff here. And Sophie looks at him and she's very serious. She says, like, yeah, we're bad guys. Don't ever forget that. We're not, you know, we are not actually the good guys. We're bad guys. We're breaking the law and we are harming people. Don't forget what we're doing. And I thought that was really interesting from Sophie in particular, considering the episode of the White Rabbit in season 5, which is one of the episodes that I'm always really conflicted about because of how it's so deeply psychologically manipulative of the Mark, who
Mm-hmm.
is not actually a bad guy. He's making decisions that are deeply informed by trauma and guilt, and knowing how much they pushed that envelope and how Sophie was uncomfortable with it because of how close they got to things going terribly, terribly wrong. It was very interesting to see her be like, "Oh no, this is what we're doing. Just don't be under any illusions about who we are and the consequences of what we're doing."
Yeah, I mean, this is part of why I think I come to this show much later than both of you because you guys were
Mm-hmm.
watching it much earlier when it was basically airing, I imagine, or very close to it. And so for me, this was like the last month of starting this show. And I think one of the things that I found really interesting is all of what we're shown in the show from start to finish, or even through this season, are things that have happened, like what you're saying. They're things that have happened, they're things that are going to happen again. Maybe not exactly as we're shown, but what we get is somewhat of kind of the fantasy that a lot of us wish we could do something about these things,
Mm-hmm.
but we don't have the expertise or the power or the money or the resources. We don't have the magic team that can get together and perform the appropriate heist to deal with these things. We can't go into, the Met and steal a painting to screw over a wealthy donor, sort of like in the Too Many Rembrandts job, which is tied to that somewhat. And so there's this element of watching them kind of grapple with what it means to do crime, to bad people in the service of helping good people. It gives for me like this really interesting outlet because the world is, in a lot of ways I feel a lot like Brianna Casey, which is like it just feels really, really dark and hopeless. But for some reason, watching these people like take down, like an annoying pharma bro is kind of like a nice cathartic release. There's something really powerful in that this show I think elicits from its start and brings up again and again just because of how much it ties to things that are real. The tower job of watching these people get taken down who literally, did a shoddy job on a building project and killed however many number of people and did horrible things to people and then threatened immigrants that with deportation if they didn't hide what actually happened.
Mm-hmm.
There's catharsis. All that rambling was there's catharsis of seeing people that are lovely analogs of real world evil monsters get their just desserts from people who are not held back by the law, by ethical restrictions, any of those things. Like most of us would not want to break the law in order to get somebody who technically didn't break the law to do what they did. Most of us wouldn't do that. We'd want
Yeah.
to, but we wouldn't necessarily do it. But it's nice to see that there's a group, this magical group, Leverage International, who's happy to do it. We'll break the law for you.
And that's the other thing, right? Like, before season 1 of Leverage, there wasn't really any kind of catharsis like this in media. Which was what made the original series like so refreshing, that you were seeing these like horrible atrocities essentially being ripped from the headlines to some extent, and you were seeing people actually like fight back against it and actually get some resolution to those issues. And when the series ended, a lot of people, myself included, went, it would be really nice to see X thing taking place in the news right now get the Leverage treatment because that person deserves it. And the thing that is so rewarding about Redemption as a result is that we get to say, I know who this person is, and I know that this person deserves to suffer like this, and I hope that they suffer like this in real life. Because we've been essentially conditioned by the original series to like ask these kinds of questions about these situations and go, these people do not deserve to get away with this, and we wish that the thing that we saw was the way that they could suffer. And now we get to like get that experience in the series, and I'm really excited to see where it continues to go, because like there are so many other people that I want to see pastiche in the series now who really deserve to suffer. Like like Leverage Redemption spoiled me in the Too Many Rembrandts job, because giving me Richard Sackler on episode 1 was like a lot, and now I need to see everybody suffer. I need to see all of the bad guys in the real world actually get their comeuppance, because like going straight for the real life situation of Richard Sackler is remarkably complex in ways that I can't even immediately fathom. But when we witnessed that in the news the first time, we were like, this is very scummy, and somebody doesn't deserve to get away with this. And for somebody to watch episode 1 of Leverage Redemption and go, this is what it would look like if they had suffered, is very rewarding emotionally.
Especially, and if you are like, for folks who actually love studying how cons work, yeah, one of the fun things about Leverage is looking and seeing if you can actually recognize cons from history. The fact that they brought up the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist, and that's part of the first episode, the Rembrandts, like it ties into like, no, this is actual history that happened in the art world in Boston. And also just the fact that art, I think the choice of the first con being related to art is deeply significant for the characters, because art theft is how Sophie and Nathan met and fell in love, shooting each other the first time because she was a thief, and at the time he was an insurance fraud investigator. But I mean, art was Sophie and Nate's origin story, it was their connection, and art came up a lot in the original series as something that bonded them uniquely. But also, like, art was something that Hardison clearly had skills in. It was one of those things where they would constantly play with the perception of Elliot as the pretty much all he does is hit things, but he's actually incredibly intellectual. He understands art. He knows cooking. It doesn't matter how much crap he gives Hardison about Star Trek. He also knows Star Trek and comics. Like, it's clearly dropped throughout the series that he knows exactly what Hardison is talking about. he's playing the jock role because it annoys Hardison. And you've got Parker who lives to steal art. Like the cutest thing in the world is her complaining about how she doesn't get to climb vents in strange vents anymore. Because we'll note at the beginning of the series, Elliot, Hardison, and Parker aren't really in the field anymore. Elliot and Parker are out in the field in terms of training the different branches of Leverage International.
Using food trucks.
Yes, using food trucks. I love that Elliot gets to do that thing that we see him talk about in season 5 episode where he is a chef's instructor, and he talks about how learning about food literally saved his life after coming back from all of the unspeakable things that he was doing when he was briefly doing wet work. But yeah, he's using the food trucks to both give veterans a foothold back into the regular world and to give them a starting point. And also those food trucks are incredibly useful, multiple mobile Lucille's. There's no one Lucille anymore. It's an entire army of Lucille's.
It's so brilliant. I love it a lot.
So can I ask, out of curiosity, I know some of the clear real-world reference. Do all of the episodes have a real-world referent?
I'm convinced that they do. I might know all of them.
Okay. What is episode 5, the Paranormal Activity Jobs real-world reference? Because it's a weird episode.
Because I love this one a lot. Paranormal Activity Job is about a young woman who accidentally burns her house down after what she believes is a haunting. And Parker actually finds her after she runs out of the house and accidentally gets hit by a car, unfortunately. And is still hung up on the idea that she was actually being haunted by a dead relative for a past negligence that she committed, only for the team to reveal to this young lady that she was actually being conned. An uncle and nephew arrangement of con artists were attempting to con people out of their houses all over New Orleans just before Halloween by pulling this exact same trick. And in the business of attempting to prove that by staging their own haunting in their new base, they not only reveal themselves to these two crooks, but eventually discover that they are in service of an assassin who is attempting to secure these houses specifically so he can assassinate a district attorney who is going to be at a parade taking place on Halloween night. And I'm not gonna lie to you, that is indeed a very weird episode. I enjoyed it a lot because I dig episodes in procedural dramas where there is a weird thing that is not supposed to be explained. Oh, it's actually just this perfectly normal thing. I'm confident that it relates to something, but I also don't think that we would know who that assassin is because he's an assassin. But I thought that was a very interesting episode personally.
I don't think the assassin was meant to be the analog. I think the fraud being committed upon people who had just lost a loved one, basically because it was mentioned that the uncle and nephew, and previously had been the uncle and the uncle and his brother, had been pulling this sort of real estate scam in New Jersey, where they were originally based, where they scan listings for whether or not somebody has recently passed away, if they own property. They go in and they check it out. And if it looks like there's not a huge amount of family involved, then they would set up the haunting, convince the person who had inherited the property to sell it at a low price because nobody wants to live in a haunted home, buy the home and then flip it and sell it for a huge profit. Like that, I think that's the beauty of the show, is that while we can pick out specific analogs for very specific public figures, episodes like The Paranormal Job are showing crimes that happen because there are people who go out and take advantage of those who are in emotionally and financially vulnerable positions. And all it takes is a little, because it's not like this guy and his nephew were even they were super bumbly. which kind of gives it away a little too early for me that they were not actually the real villain. They were way too bumbly, like making all sorts of noise. And you know, as soon as it looks like the con is going to go too easily, something bad is going to happen. I did personally feel like the district attorney political figure who was being set up to be assassinated felt like an analog to AOC for me, or at least
Yeah,
an analog.
definitely.
Yeah, you're like, oh, it's this, this very progressive political figure from New Jersey who is making powerful people, including the mob, nervous.
And like the fact that she was popular with young people too. The fact that Brianna knew who she was by name and was excited specifically because she was there.
Yes. I do feel like this was more of a character episode than actually. It was more about the characters in the con this time, because
Mm-hmm.
I agree.
we had Parker calling back to the episode in season 2 with Luke Perry as the fake psychic, where Parker said that,
Ah,
she's like, oh yeah, well, there was this time that I used to believe in psychics, and a fake psychic really hurt me by bringing up some stuff, but my friends were there to show me how it was a con. And this is, so we want to show you, because it is not your fault that your grandmother died, because this poor girl is blaming herself for her grandmother's death because she wanted to go out and get a cup of coffee, and and when she came back, her grandmother had passed away, and she was filled with guilt for looking away for just one moment because she needed a break. I feel like that also was a really human moment that after the pandemic, so many people would be able to relate to. The I'm just so tired, I just need 5 minutes to myself, and you look away for 5 minutes and the worst possible thing happens. That felt really heavy.
I'm not gonna lie to you. Like, I mean, it's very difficult for me to say I have a favorite episode because I love all of these episodes. But this episode in particular stuck with me. First of all, as a fan, because I just love the fact that Parker had that moment of like to make that decision that I'm going to get somebody out of a situation where
Mm-hmm.
I felt hopeless once. But you are right. In the wake of the pandemic, the thing that hits me the most about that episode is there are moments where I'm just like really overwhelmed being one of only two people in this household and like trying to like do what is necessary while also just being very overwhelmed and very tired and very exhausted and very anxious about everything. To be told that it's not, it doesn't make you a bad person to feel
Mm-hmm.
like you need a break. I really appreciated that.
Yeah, I didn't really click with with that episode that much until that moment. Although I gotta say, Sophie's New Orleans, heiress drawl was the whole
Yeah.
dramatic thing was, it was beautiful. I missed Sophie's cons, and we still get to see some callbacks in like particular the card game to how she can be terrible unless she's actually enacting the con.
yes.
Uh-huh.
The sonnet
Oh
that she reads. Yeah, because I love that where they're trying desperately to like feed into this like eccentric card game maker like guru. He's all of these things, and they're trying to feed into him to make sure that he doesn't sell the company to evil Pharma Bro by
Mm-hmm.
playing on his kind of like on his vanity, but not in a like horrific way, more in a like, I really want to impress you, I want you to feel like this thing that you're part of matters. And there's a great speech at the end that Brianna gives, which is fantastic, and it is the moment when he's about to sell everything, and she just goes on this speech about how like no, like this thing that you created, it's not just a business, it's this thing that we all are connected to. It's for all the like rejects of the world that don't feel connected to the world around them, but here they do, they feel part of something. And it moves him so much that he decides that he's going to go back on his word to sell to Farmer Bro and continue to maintain the company because of how much of an impact he's had. That whole episode is, honestly, that's my favorite episode of the entire.
that whole episode was a love letter. It was a love letter to the
To
nerd
nerds.
community. It really was. I mean, like John Rogers is absolutely a nerd. I feel like the two strongest speeches given throughout the entire series were given by Hardison at the end of episode 1 and by Brianna at the end of the card game. But I will just say quick shout out to whoever decided to dress Harry Wilson up as a self-important creator of this fantasy world, and the costume they had him come out in. I screamed. My husband was in the kitchen and he came and he's like, "What?" I'm like, "You have to look at the costume."
The ridiculous beard.
The hat and the suspenders are what got me. I was like, "Oh my god."
I was up at like 1:30 in the morning watching that episode when I watched it and shrieked, and I think I woke up my neighbors. So I have a lot of feelings about the card game job, not only because that costume is awesome, but like, first of all, the thing that stands out to me the most is, one, as a big Magic the Gathering fan, I just love that a card game was here and that it seemed to have rules instead of actually just being cards just moving on a table. But I also dug it because Martin Shkreli was the pastiche that we're having in this episode, because even though the real life analog isn't a card game, it is actually still referencing a thing that Martin Shkreli actually did do, which I thought was really cool.
Which was what? I didn't get that part. What did he do?
Because it's a totally separate space, but he bought a limited edition Wu-Tang Clan album.
Oh, that!
For like millions of dollars in auction, taunted people on Twitter for several days in a row about the fact that he's the only person who will ever have it, and then streamed it live on like Periscope or something like that, just to like shove it in people's faces. I'm really glad that was the thing that they tried to do in this episode, was to like take an artistic expression that he was attempting to taint and make hollow by not actually caring about it, and make that the thing that they were going to get him on, was the thing that I was like personally fulfilled by.
Oh, yeah. That's great. I completely forgot about the Wu-Tang album thing, because it really was like, there's so many levels in this episode about like talking about you have the creator who really was idealistic and loved his original vision, but now is sort of jaded because he's like, oh, it's become commercial and co-opted. It doesn't really. It's only a business now. It doesn't really have meaning, and it's not because he's a bad person. He's cynical. He's a cynical artist who saw the thing that he loved eaten by capitalism. Which makes Brianna's speech. It felt like that is what so many of us are fighting for in SFF, in fandom, in nerd culture, is to keep something open and available to people that has made us feel like we belong somewhere at points in our lives where we felt unmoored, where we felt misunderstood and unloved. And it wasn't that gatekeeping version of nerd culture. It was the like, no, this thing matters to us because we love it, and because we didn't feel alone anymore because of all the other people who we met through it, and helped us realize that that it's okay to be weird and different because all these other people are weird and different too. Right? Like, I love that they were very careful about that, but it's also a very interesting conversation about the push-pull between artistic vision and capitalism.
Like, there are two moments in the episode that really, really stuck with me. First was Sophie reading the poem, because obviously I'm a poet, I'm going to have a lot of feelings about it.
It's a great poem.
It is really dope. Yeah. Like, the poem is actually astoundingly written. I kind of want to find the writer who wrote that poem and shake their hand, because it was really rad. But the thing that I love about that moment is that meanwhile Parker, who is on the job, who is about to steal a thing, is not simply following rules in this moment, but is actually getting lost in that poem. And that's how we as the audience witness that this is a poem that the author wrote about their own personal experience struggling with what appeared to be mental illness, and like going through like this like deep depressive moment in their lives, and finding value through making, that I thought was really rewarding. But the thing that really got me about Brianna's speech at the end is, as a person of color and as a fan of Leverage, as someone who really, really loves Leverage, because of characters like Hardison, who like give us an opportunity to see ourselves being our as nerdy and as smart and as thoughtful as possible. Brianna really stuck with me in that episode because it felt like at that point I was seeing even more of myself as a nerd through Brianna, even more than I've ever seen through Hardison.
Mm.
And I'm sure I'm not reading into it, but I might be reading into it. But that speech really gave me the impression that part of what was also being communicated there was how queer nerds also find community
Yes.
in these kinds of spaces. And as somebody who kind of valued Magic the Gathering as an outlet for that as well, and values like science fiction and fantasy fandom in general as an opportunity to actually express myself through that sense, I really, really appreciated that. And I really wanted the episode to be more overt about it, but I get that like that was enough at that moment, but I wish that they just like said the whole word. I just have so many feelings about that episode.
Oh, I really hope they follow through with that thread in the next 8 episodes.
Right?
It'll be very interesting. And I do want to say, Brandon, now that I know that you're a Magic the Gathering fan, next time we were in person at a convention, I will bring a blue control deck just to annoy you.
I'm not sure if I'm mad or impressed yet. The fact that you have a control deck, I'm not sure if I hate you or love you yet. I look forward to that. We will make this happen, you know. I look forward to this a great deal.
The card game in this isn't just a card game. It has basically like a Ren fair every year,
Ooh,
right?
right.
Where they show up and they have like jousting and card championship, and they have all like costumes and all of this stuff, and they hang out in this little community with a castle on this property that, you know, all of it. There's all this stuff. There's tons of stuff there. And I've never seen anything like that for Magic the Gathering. And so I submit that currently the card game in this episode is the greatest card game on Earth.
Just a little bit, yes.
Can we give a really quick shout out of love to Elliot in the jousting scene?
Oh, Lord.
Oh my God. I thought we were going to see Elliot on a horse. What we got was even better, was Elliot wearing one of those inflatable, like, floaty dragon things and having to, like, run across the field at his opponent. And then the poor dragon getting deflated. And then it's a totally comic moment. And then we flip to this really spectacular broadsword fight with Elliot Elliot's in full armor. He's using his gauntlets correctly. Like, and it's that hero moment that we all love to get with Elliot.
Also, that sword fight was the thing that reminded me that I'm pretty confident that like most of the Ren Fair elements in that episode are references to Dean Devlin's other television show, The Outpost, which I haven't finished.
Haven't seen it yet.
And there's definitely some other, so I think there's some Librarians references here because of Noah Weil and a couple of other things, which I've not seen the Librarians, but I read the trivia, so this is why I know.
You should.
I would also, Jonathan Frakes directs one of the episodes in this, and I don't know if he had a cameo in anything in this particular grouping of episodes, but I know he has been in other episodes of Leverage, and I would love to see Jonathan Frakes come back in some way, because not just as director, like as a character in anything, because anytime that man shows up, I like the joy in my soul increases by 100%, because I just adore Jonathan Frakes, and also he deserves way more credit for being a pretty fantastic director than he has been given.
Yeah. I mean, he directed the Double-Edged Sword job, and a lot of things are happening in that episode.
I had mixed feelings about that episode. Like, I thought the character moments, particularly between Elliot and Brianna, again, like, Brianna, I think they were really good in how they wrote Brianna's character to, she's having her own moments of doubt and growing into herself as a person. But they have her doing so in a way that calls back to some of the other characters' previous moments of growth in the original series. Like, because in the Double-Edged Sword job, what we have is a examination of data privacy, there's some touching of police violence, and I wish they had done more with that. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I wish they had done something to the cop who was chasing his wife, who was trying to get out of their abusive relationship. But she has this moment where she's like, "Yeah, I really hate guys like this who are." Mining people's data and using it without their permission, because all it's doing is drilling us down to our worst moments. And she uses that exact phrase, our worst moments, which is what you see this look. And, Christian Kane is really good at these micro expressions as Elliot, because that look just crosses his face, because that was the exact phrase he used in season 3 when the team found out about his past with Damien Moreau. And he was just like, the worst moment, the worst thing I've ever done in my life was for Damien Moreau. And we still to this day don't know what it is, although we can probably guess. To me, it was very clear that that was the memory that Elliot had when he was listening to Brianna talk about not wanting to be judged on her worst moments. And he gives her a really nice, like, he's like, look, all of us have a past. What matters is who we are and what we are doing now to correct for that. It's all like, that is a really good moment, but I wasn't sure that the way that they handled the programmer was really all. I felt very conflicted about that, because he wasn't an out bad guy. I got
Mm-hmm.
more the sense that this is someone who had a great deal of anxiety and difficulty relating to other people. And seeing as how well they had handled Parker as someone who didn't know how to relate to people who had done bad things, but wasn't some sort of irredeemable person because of it. It was weird to see them treat the villain of that episode this way.
I think part of what bothered me about that episode is something you brought up like a minute ago, which is we focus on this guy who is doing something bad, but there's nothing in the episode, as you say, that marks him clearly as a bad person. He's doing a thing that is morally questionable, but he's not running, other than he's kind of sometimes can be persnickety. He's not a monster. He's not running around running over children. He's not collapsing buildings by, breaking the rules. But the very beginning of that episode, we have somebody who is a bad person, and the episode dumps it.
Yeah.
Yeah. He's just kind of dealt with. So one of the things that kind of bothered me about this episode is the idea that it would have been a lot more rewarding if this was perhaps the one time in this season even where the end of the episode is, we can resolve this without somebody suffering, we can resolve this with somebody learning that this was improper and just deciding no longer to do it. But also, what kind of rubbed me the wrong way, and this is not me like bashing the show or casting aspersions on anybody, the two villains who I feel like they get some very weird and hostile treatment in these first 8 episodes, both of them just so happen to be people of color.
Because there's also the gambling.
The rolling on the river jump.
Yeah. We should definitely talk about that.
I mean, I like the episode. I think that on its face, very functionally, it stands out that like this character would be the bad guy. Like it I'm not saying that he's not a bad person. He hasn't done absolutely terrible things, but they show very overtly at 2 very like deliberate points in the story reminds us of the fact that he's a person of color. Once when he speaks to Sophie and like admits that his greatest frustration in his business life is that white people can consistently change the rules on him whenever they want, and that has made it difficult for him to continue to work. But then later on, when Parker is like beginning the con at the gun club, when she looks him in the eye and says, "We've been here since New Orleans was a part of France. You weren't." There's a lot of very hostile energy in that kind of line. And I get why she did it. I'm not saying that like Parker's decision as a character was improper. She's on a con. But from the episode's perspective, in a wider sense, I would have loved for some part of that conversation to observe the fact that, yes, the fact that you had to go through this kind of hardship in order to succeed is in fact bad and unhealthy. But this is not the way to resolve it. No one ever confronts him with that fact.
I wish, I wanted the episode to call that out much more strongly because, yes, absolutely, it's frustrating watching your parents struggle to build a business because they're brown immigrants and white people keep changing the rules, asking for bribes. And I think the implication that he had lost his seat as a congressman for taking bribes, his bitterness was not that he was caught, but that he gets caught and loses his job, when clearly we all know what happens when it's, a white politician who will get a slap on the wrist and not automatically lose their job. So I think because the episode didn't dive into this more, into the story having a chance to really confront him with yes, you've been wronged. The way that people of color are treated in this system is terrible, but what you're doing is causing more harm, particularly as you are the child of brown immigrants, who is trying to rob Black people of their homes in New Orleans after Katrina. There's none of this is okay. And if we'd had that moment where he says, yeah, it kind of sucks, but that's the way the game is played anyway, I'm going to go ahead and do it, it wouldn't have felt as mushy and murky.
Yeah.
Because you would have had him choose at that moment.
Yeah, if he had acknowledged that I'm just playing by the rules that they have given me, and I acknowledge that it's hurting it's hurting people who I should be in solidarity with, and I admit that I don't care, that would have worked. But also, what kind of rubs me the wrong way about it is, from a story perspective, all he gets to see at the end of the episode is two white people he has never met stole all of the money from his fault. And that's the part that sucks. The part that sucks. That from a wider narrative perspective, this is a story of an admittedly crooked person of color being conned by a pair of white people immediately after admitting to someone that his greatest frustration is that white people continue to come out on top ahead of him, regardless of the criminal activities that they've engaged in. And that sucks.
And it ties into what we see in the double-edged sword job, because again, the one who really gets caught and suffers is the Asian man who created this AI and this whole program. But the ones who were facilitating the blatantly immoral use of the technology that he was creating was was the white dude who has been his friend since college, and was the one who was reaching out to these shady security paramilitary groups offering. It just felt like that switch to here's what's really going on was way too out of left field, because I was expecting the whole thing to tie into some kind of police corruption and law enforcement abusing the technology, right? And it's weird how it shifts any culpability or comeuppance from law enforcement, who is clearly shielding an abusive cop, or the white corporate interests who are trying to skirt regulations about data privacy and image use, to resting on the anxiety-ridden, admittedly, just is more interested in the program, in creating a program and what it can do than how it will affect people, Asian man. And there were some weird reflections of tropes about Asian men being antisocial and more focused on technology than people, where I was like, oh, this is not what I expect. That whole episode was below standards of what I would normally expect.
My concern with a handful of the episodes here, which is that they introduce a lot of things that are concerning elements, whether it's a racial component, which Michi, you talked about in a lot of detail, or the technology component, and it's linked to the police and this sort of Minority Report-esque technology that might exist, or other things. It introduces these, and it wants them to be important, but some of the episodes don't want to deal with them. They just kind of like, it's a thing, and now we'll deal with this other element, and that'll be the end of our story. Instead of maybe saying, well, maybe we don't need it to also have all these other things. Like
Mhm.
maybe the story doesn't need to be about, an Asian tech guy who is a bunch of stereotypes living in a house with a talking house computer. That doesn't need to be the focus. Maybe it's actually just the police who have hired somebody to provide the service, and they're taking down this police department in this small town, because then
Mhm.
that actually deals with the central problem. It's the people that are providing the financing and all of the other issues. And I still get a little annoyed that we don't deal with the fact that there is an abusive cop. He doesn't get dealt with in any significant way.
I mean, they even have the federal marshal who literally says, "Oh, I'm here because the sudden drop in crime in this town is really suspicious," and
Yeah.
nothing happens. Nothing
Yeah.
aside from maybe Elliot gets an occasional hookup interest.
Yeah, and what I think is interesting is if you take something like the tower job as a counter, right? What the tower job I think does very effectively, whatever problems it may also have in how it deals with its main villain, the fellow who runs all the buildings,
Mm-hmm.
it does introduce the immigration issue, but because it introduces it at the very end as a small segment of the story, it's not central to the rest of the story. So we're not supposed to think, oh, well, this was part of the whole story the whole time. No, it is resolved as a sort of side story to say like, oh, this was also going on, but this isn't the focus. This is our denouement. This is our end, where we get our happy story. If it had started the episode with that and then not resolved it, we end up with something like these other episodes we've been talking about. It doesn't need to, because the focus is we're just getting the tower people, who are monstrous white people who don't care about anybody, and then there's potential problems with how we deal with trauma in that episode. But the immigration issue is not the central concern of the episode.
So I hope that this doesn't continue in the later episodes of the season, because what I do think ultimately maybe a source of that problem is writing in a way that thinks about what the problem is instead of thinking about who are the people who actually suffer as a result of that problem, which
Mm-hmm.
is like not immediately noticeable, because a lot of the earlier episodes really do care about the people who are actually
Mm-hmm.
affected by these kinds of decisions. And that's why the reason why the double-edged sword job bothers me the most is we have a victim, and that victim's like complication is specifically because of a harassing ex-husband who just so happens to have the power of the police department
Mm-hmm.
working
Mm-hmm.
behind him. Like that should have been a very lovely focus, in part because you have already primed me to think that the person who deserves to suffer is this ex-husband. So that's the person who I want to see stop. Everything else feels kind of secondary, and
Yep.
it feels like that because I feel like someone at some point went, I want to write a tech episode so we can solve a tech problem. How do we get to that point? And thought about all of those things as ways to get to that point, instead of thinking about who's actually affected as a result.
Yeah,
Yep.
and I think part of this too, it would be, the going back to this concern of, the person that ultimately gets punished here is a person of color who isn't doing something inherently evil. He's not an evil person. He's a
Yeah, he doesn't
complicated
have
person.
malicious intent. He actually
Right.
thinks that he's helping people. He
He
actually
thinks
thinks
he's
that he's
helping
saving
people.
people's lives.
Yeah.
We should have taught him that's not the case. We
Right.
didn't.
They should have taught him, because the person they do teach is in the paranormal activity job, where they're actually committing crimes,
And they
and
get the
the
nephew out.
nephew, they get the
Yeah.
nephew out and let him go back to school and let him redeem himself by basically letting him walk. He's actually committing crimes, doing bad things.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe potentially unwilling. He doesn't really want to do it, but he's still doing it.
He's still complicit.
Hmm.
He made the decision to like, yeah, I will join the family business, I guess, because obligations, whatever. But it's still an active choice, and he gets to walk off scot free.
And I don't have a problem with him necessarily walking off. I have a problem with the unequalness of
Yes.
how this is, right, because it's clear he's not. He doesn't want to be here. He doesn't want to be doing this, but he's sucked into it because of the family business. And wouldn't it be nice if both episodes said, well, maybe we should try to help both of them. You know, maybe the tech guy, he needs help. Maybe he needs, like, there's this bit in the episode where they're dealing with, like, they're pretending to be, like, manners people or whatever that
Yeah,
profession's called.
Like social consultants or something like
Yeah,
that.
where they're teaching him how to talk to people.
Mhm.
Well, maybe they actually put him in touch with some folks, like, you know, some therapy or some folks who can provide him with
Parker's
actual resources to help
therapist.
him. Parker's therapist. Give him some puppets. Do it.
You know, you accidentally hit on the thing that ultimately bothers me the most about that episode. When you make a show, the subtitle of the show of which is redemption, you'd imagine that when someone is given the opportunity to be redeemed and actually deserves it, you can give it to them. As we mentioned with the paranormal activity job, people get that opportunity. We gave the nephew the opportunity to decide, I don't want to be a part of this anymore. And he gets to potentially make his life better and actually, like, improve as a person. We could have given this character the same treatment, and we didn't, because we wanted him to look like an absolute villain, even though the show doesn't make him look like an absolute villain. And it felt, like, very disappointing as a result.
I hope we do not see any more missteps like that in the next batch of episodes. Again, it's not going to be perfect, but I really hope that that there were folks in the writer's room who were able to spot some of these things before they made it out of the drafting process, and they were able to tweak it. Like, don't bring in the thing unless you're willing to close it. It's like what Barry Robinette talks about with short fiction and closing different story tags, like closing code. If you don't close it in the right order, it just feels weird. It's left hanging, and the audience is like, I think there's something missing, but I can't figure, like, this isn't satisfying me, and I don't know why. They didn't close the tags.
Those darn tags.
Because it all comes back to programming, right?
Well, okay, we gotta stop.
Yes, or else we will be here for, it's already an hour and a half of recording, oh lord.
This is what happens when leverage. We need to go steal more time.
Yes, we do, and we will do that at some point.
Really, what happened here is you all conned me into recording a longer podcast than I intended.
See what you did there.
Very good. Okay. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today for Screen Scouts. Before we head out, we want to let our delightful guests let us know where their stuff is. So, Michi, where can folks find you and your things?
Okay, so as some folks may know by now, I'm stepping down from SFWA, Science Fiction Fantasy Writers of America, as editor-in-chief after a year and a half, or 2 years, actually. I am currently senior editor, soon to be features editor at Prism, which is a BIPOC-led and BIPOC-focused news organization. So as Brandon was talking about, you want to think about who are the people most impacted by actions. Those are the stories and voices we try to highlight in our news coverage. So you can find me on Prism. I am an editor. Hopefully will have some more time to write in the next couple of months. You can also find me on Twitter at Geek Melange, which was sort of my little ode to Dune. So I am the Spice Melange. I'm super excited about Dune coming out in October. So you can find me ranting on Twitter. You can also, I have a public profile on Facebook. I don't always post to public, but you can find me there. And I'm also on Instagram as Geek Melange, but please, everybody continue to support SFWA. They are doing fantastic work at truly making the organization more reflective of what the industry is like. Please check out Prism. And if you were in Chicago, come check out Rax Geek Rax Inferno, which is the belly dancing fire performance group that I belong to. Now that things are easing up, we are starting to go back to in-person shows. I have my first live fire performance on July 30th for the first time since March 2020. So if you're in the city, come check us out. We're a Asian American majority, LGBTQ majority performance troupe.
Awesome. Well, go check out all of Michi's things, which will be linked in the show notes as well if you want to find them there. And thank you again, Michi, for coming on. I know it was such a trial to be here today.
Oh, I know. Really so terribly hard. I mean, Brandon had to twist my arm on Twitter asking me if I was going to, It's like, I'm sorry, I know you're very busy, but do you have time? I'm like, it's leverage. Give me the date and time. I will make time in my calendar.
Well, for listeners back home, thank you for listening today. If you'd like to, again, let us know what you thought. If you have opinions about the episodes, skiffingfanty.com/listener suggestions. You can follow us at skiffingfanty on Twitter and Instagram and get the newsletter at skiffyandfanty.com/newsletter. And as always, if you want to support the show, please go to patreon.com/skiffyandfanty. And then other than that, 5-star review on iTunes, because that's what you do when you love a podcast, is you go on iTunes and you give 5 stars and then you say something silly and put a dad joke in there. So A+ for dad jokes.
Maybe not dad jokes, but still.
No, dad jokes, because dad jokes aren't offensive and they make us giggle because they're terrible.
Fair enough.
Anyway, you can find me at Sean Duke on Twitter, seanduke.net, and patreon.com/thejoyfactory.
And you can find me at The Rising Tides on Twitter, BrandonO'Brien.space, and on Speculate, where I currently GM The Case of the Cindered Seal, a Blades Indie Doc actual play miniseries.
Awesome. Well, on that note, I just want Brandon to know that during this entire episode, I have been hacking you with a clam.
That explains it.
Yep.
I knew something was up.
Well played.
And on that note, awkward ending and scene. If you want to support this show, you can go to patreon.com/skiffyandfanty or skiffyandfanty.com, our website, where you can get access to all of our fancy things. Our music comes from Holy Mole. You can support him and his work at patreon.com/holymole. Thank you for listening.